Jean Lee was born on December 10, 1919, in New South Wales, under the name Marjorie Jean Maud Wright, the youngest offspring of Charles Wright and Florence Wright. Charles worked on the railway, and the Wright family was known for their esteemed reputation. In 1927, they moved to Chatswood, a suburb of Sydney, where Marjorie attended Chatswood Public School and Willoughby Central Domestic High School. In March of 1938, at the age of 18, Marjorie married Raymond Breeze, a house painter 7 years her senior, whom she had reportedly known since childhood. However, their union faced financial hardships as Breeze struggled with regular unemployment and heavy drinking. In July of 1939, shortly after Marjorie gave birth to their daughter, Breeze was convicted of auto theft and received a 3-month suspended sentence, placed under a 2-year good behavior bond. Between 1942 and 1943, Marjorie and Breeze separated, leaving her as a single mother struggling to provide for herself and her daughter. Eventually, Marjorie entrusted the care of her child to her mother. Towards the end of 1942, Marjorie journeyed by overnight train to Brisbane and secured employment as a waitress at Lennon's Hotel. In late 1943, nearing the conclusion of her time in Brisbane, Marjorie encountered Morris Diaz. She lived with Diaz for approximately 3 years, relocating with him to Sydney and then Adelaide. In February of 1944, the couple traveled to Perth and checked into a hotel under the surname Pierce. Marjorie and Diaz stayed in Perth for approximately 11 months, during which Marjorie began drinking heavily, and Diaz occasionally subjected her to physical abuse. When questioned why she didn't leave Diaz, she cited the difficulty of departing Perth during the wartime era. Upon their departure in 1945, they headed to Sydney. Shortly after arriving, Diaz was arrested on outstanding charges, leaving Marjorie with the burden of supporting him financially by engaging in prostitution. Marjorie operated in the King's Cross and Darlinghurst districts of Sydney, with Diaz acting as her protector. She worked on the streets, or occasionally in brothels, earning between 15 and 20 pounds a night. Employing numerous aliases in encounters with law enforcement for offensive behavior, she notably used the name Jean Lee. Between May of 1945 and July of 1948, she made 23 appearances at the Sydney Central Police Court. In 1946, Lee and Diaz departed Sydney for Tasmania, likely in an attempt to evade police scrutiny. There, Lee terminated her relationship with Diaz and returned to Sydney, resuming her work as a prostitute and intensifying her alcohol consumption. In August of 1946, she secured employment as a barmaid at the Liverpool Arms Hotel, situated at the corner of Pitt and King Street, juggling her daytime shifts behind the bar with nighttime work in a brothel. In late 1946, Lee crossed paths with Robert David Clayton, marking the beginning of a tumultuous and occasionally violent relationship. Clayton, a former Royal Australian Air Force stores clerk, had a history of disciplinary issues during his military service, leading to his dismissal in January of 1941. After a brief stint in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, Clayton was discharged in 1943. By 1945, he had divorced his wife. In April of 1946, prior to meeting Lee, Clayton faced convictions for theft and false pretenses in the Sydney Central Criminal Court. His modus operandi involved responding to advertisements from women seeking rental flats, deceiving them into handing over money for fictitious rent requirements. Despite being sentenced to 6 months imprisonment with potential early release upon restitution, Clayton's criminal activities persisted. As Clayton and Lee's relationship evolved, Clayton assumed the role of her protector, living off her earnings while indulging in a gambling habit. Despite his flaws and occasional aggression, Lee regarded Clayton as the love of her life, praising him even as she awaited trial. In November of 1946, they stayed with Lee's mother in Tokley, where Clayton's discontent with domestic life led to a violent incident involving 2 young women. Clayton and an associate, Norman Bolger, attempted to assault the young women near Nora Head, resulting in their arrest on December 23rd. Clayton received a 21-month sentence for indecent assault, to run concurrently with his existing terms for previous offenses. Lee returned to prostitution after Clayton's arrest, accumulating further convictions during his trial and imprisonment. In 1948, Raymond Breeze initiated divorce proceedings against Lee, which finalized in June. Despite regularly visiting Clayton in Long Bay Jail, Lee found him sullen and critical during their encounters. Upon Clayton's release in September of 1949, the couple engaged in a brief stint of blackmail, exploiting Clayton's false portrayal as a wronged husband in extortion schemes known as the Badger Game or Ginger Game. In early October 1949, Lee and Clayton amassed 250 pounds from prostitution and their extortion scam, prompting them to plan a working holiday in Melbourne during the spring racing season. They traveled from Sydney to Melbourne on October 14, 1949, and initially stayed at Carleon's Hotel in Spencer Street. Their days were filled with attending race meetings and nightclubs, often accompanied by heavy drinking. As their funds dwindled, they moved on to the more modest Duke of Windsor Hotel. To replenish their finances, they resorted to blackmail. At the Werribee Cup race meeting on October 26, they encountered Norman Andrews, an acquaintance from Sydney who had flown to Melbourne on October 18. On November 7th, Lee, Clayton, and Andrews were at the University Hotel in Carlton when they met William Pop Kent, a 73-year-old SP bookmaker. Lee flirted with Kent, and the trio accompanied him back to his residence at Mallow House in Dorrit Street. Lee posed as a dancer named Mesha Vitos, claiming Clayton and Andrews were her brother and his friend. As the evening progressed, Lee attempted to access Kent's money, hidden in his fob pocket, but was unsuccessful. After Clayton and Andrews left the room for a brief period, Lee tried again, this time resorting to sexual acts, but still couldn't retrieve the money. Frustrated, Lee resorted to violence, hitting Kent with a wine bottle and assaulting him with a broken chair leg. Clayton and Andrews joined in, tying Kent up and torturing him for over an hour, demanding to know where he had hidden more money. Mary McWilliam, a neighbor, knocked on the door, prompting Andrews to distract her while Clayton choked Kent to death. Another resident, May Howard, became suspicious and called the police after noticing the unusual silence from Kent's room. After leaving Kent's apartment, Lee, Clayton, and Andrews booked flights to Adelaide for the following morning. They changed out of their bloody clothing at the Great Southern Hotel, drank at a nightclub, and eventually boarded their flight, with Lee admitting that she was heavily intoxicated when they left the club. Upon arrival at the scene of Pop Kent's murder, detectives swiftly launched into their investigative duties, interviewing witnesses and scouring for evidence to identify the perpetrators. Armed with descriptions of the woman and two men provided by boarding house residents, as well as staff from the University Hotel, detectives combed through inner-city hotels, questioning desk clerks and night porters into the early hours. Around 3:40 a.m., they reached the Great Southern Private Hotel near Spencer Street railway station. The night porter, upon hearing descriptions matching the suspects, directed detectives to three guests who had checked in the day before, a Mr. and Mrs. Lee in a double room and a Mr. Andrews in a single room. The trio returned briefly the previous evening before leaving again in a taxi. Convinced they had found their suspects, detectives used the room key to search. In the double room, they discovered a blood-stained blue coat and skirt, along with a bloodied man's shirt. In the single room, another shirt with blood spots was found. The detectives then waited in the hotel lobby. At approximately 4:20 a.m., Lee and her companions returned in a drunken state and were promptly apprehended. They were taken to Russell Street headquarters in separate cars and placed in different interview rooms for questioning. Initially, Lee refused to cooperate with questioning, exercising her right to silence. Despite persistent interrogation, she remained steadfast. However, when detectives presented a statement from Clayton implicating her and Andrews in the murder, Lee's emotional state deteriorated. She eventually confessed, shifting blame solely onto herself, claiming responsibility for bashing Kent over the head with a bottle. Later, she retracted her statement, attributing it to a desire for peace and quiet. Andrews, Clayton, and Lee were charged with Kent's murder and held in custody. The city coroner determined Kent's cause of death and committed the trio for trial. Subsequently, their defense counsel successfully secured an adjournment until February, citing the need for time to prepare their defense. The trial of Clayton, Andrews, and Lee, accused of Kent's murder, commenced on Monday, March 20th, 1950, in the Melbourne Criminal Court, presided over by Justice Gavin Duffy. Over the course of days 3 and 4, each defendant took the stand, vehemently denying any violent actions towards Kent or involvement in his robbery. They asserted Kent was in good health when they left him. When questioned about the blood-stained items found in her room, Lee claimed it was from a nosebleed earlier that day. Clayton, when pressed about why he initially incriminated Lee, whom he professed to love, responded with remorse, stating he acted out of self-preservation. He believed his false statement would absolve him without harming the others, whom he deemed innocent. The trial concluded on Saturday morning, March 25th, with the jury delivering guilty verdicts for all 3 defendants. Lee collapsed into Clayton's arms upon hearing the verdict, vehemently protesting her innocence. When Justice Gavin Duffy sentenced them to death, Lee sobbed and Clayton unleashed a tirade of insults at the judge and jury. On May 19, 1950, the Court of Criminal Appeal overturned the convictions of Lee, Clayton, and Andrews, citing concerns over the admissibility of statements obtained by the police. Some judges criticized the interrogation methods used by the police. In June of 1950, the Crown appealed to the High Court, which unanimously upheld the convictions. The convicted trio then sought to appeal to the Privy Council, requesting financial aid from the state, which was denied by the state cabinet on July 17th. On December 12, 1950, the state cabinet confirmed the death sentence imposed on the 3 prisoners, setting a date for their executions. Following the failed appeals, Lee's mental state deteriorated significantly. She oscillated between violently attacking her prison guards and pleading for mercy, adamantly maintaining her innocence and expressing disbelief that a woman would face hanging. As the looming execution date approached, her behavior became increasingly erratic. Lee's final visit occurred on the Saturday preceding her execution, during which 3 friends from Sydney spent a brief half-hour with her before departing. Andrew's wife and Clayton's mother, both from Sydney, visited the condemned men on Sunday afternoon. On the morning of Monday, February 19, 1951, Jean Lee was hanged at Pentridge Prison. She was escorted from her cell to the gallows by the executioner and his assistant, wearing a hood and handcuffed with her hands in front of her. Witnesses reported that Lee seemed unconscious at the time of her execution. 2 hours later, Robert Clayton and Norman Andrews were hanged together. The bodies of the 3 were laid to rest in the prison graveyard designated for executed prisoners. Jean Lee's execution marked the last time a woman was put to death in Australia. She stood as one of only 2 women executed in Australia during the 20th century, the other being Martha Rundle, who was hanged in 1909 in Western Australia for the murder of her husband's children. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button to join our community. We upload every Monday and Thursday at 4 p.m. For more content like this, be sure to check out our other videos on the channel. You can also follow us on our other social media platforms for uploads and updates. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.